Use factoring to solve 2x squared minus 7x plus 3 is equal to 0. When you are doing factoring, you are trying to break this into two terms that multiply to 2x squared minus 7x plus 3. And in this particular case, if you put a 2x here and an x here, those two terms right there are going to multiply to 2x squared. Now here you have a 3, so if this thing is going to factor, and it may not factor, but it might, if you have a 3 here, there's a temptation to either put a 1 and a 3 here, or a 3 and a 1 here. Now the way you figure out which way it goes is you've got the 2 here, which needs to be multiplied by something, which will eventually get you to negative 7x. So I would be tempted to put the 3 here, because when we do FOIL, which is first, outside, inside, last, the 3 will get multiplied by 2x, and that'll give us 6x, and then the x will get multiplied by 1. Now the last thing you have to do here is figure out the signs, and because you have a negative here and a positive here, the sign pattern is particularly easy. These are both negatives. Now, we should check to see if that's right, and the way you check to see if that's right is you use something called FOIL. First, outside, inside, and last. So what you do here is you multiply the first terms, which is 2x and x. When those get multiplied, there's your 2x squared, so that's good. Then you multiply the outside terms, and those outside terms are 2x and negative 3. Now that's a negative 6x. The inside terms are negative 1 and x. That's a negative x. So you know when you have negative 6x minus x, that gives you your minus 7x. So that matches up. Finally, the last terms are negative 1 and negative 3. When those get multiplied, you get a positive 3. So that's a way of checking to see if you have factored properly. Now the equation at this point looks just like this, 2x minus 1 multiplied by x minus 3 equals 0. And that's kind of the same generically as saying one thing, which I'm going to call a here, times another thing is equal to 0. Well, when is that true? When is it true that one thing multiplied by another thing gives you 0? And the answer is if a happens to be 0 or if b happens to be 0, then they will multiply to 0. So when you apply that to this particular situation, you will have 2x minus 1 equals 0. And I'll always write an or in between here. Or x minus 3 happens to be equal to 0. So we have two different linear equations to solve. Let's start with the first one. First thing I'm going to do is add 1 to both sides of this equation. When I add 1 to the left-hand side of this equation, I get 2x. When I add 1 to the right-hand side of this equation, I get 1. The last step is to divide both sides of the equation by 2. When I divide the left-hand side by 2, I get just x. When I divide the right-hand side by 2, I get 1/2. Now let's go over and solve the other equation. Here we have x minus 3 is equal to 0. The way you solve this equation is you add 3 to both sides. When you add 3 to the left-hand side, you just get x. When you add 3 to the right-hand side, you get 3. So now we have our solution here. It is either x is equal to 1/2 or x is equal to 3. Now we should definitely go back in case we have made an error along the way and check both of these solutions. Let's check the first one. So for x equal to 1/2, we take our x equals 1/2 and we plug it into here to see if we indeed get 0. So in this case we have 2 times 1/2 squared minus 7 times 1/2 plus 3. And we're going to calculate that and see if, in fact, that is equal to 0. So that's what we're checking. Well, 1/2 squared is 1/4, and 1/4 multiplied by 2 is 1/2. And so this is 1/2 minus 7 times 1/2 is 7/2 plus 3, and we are checking to see if that is equal to 0. Well, we need to have a common denominator to add these things, so this is going to be 1/2 minus 7/2, and 3 is the same as 6/2. You get that by multiplying 3 by 2 divided by 2. We're checking to see if that is equal to 0. And if you take 1/2 plus 6/2, that's 7/2, minus the 7/2, that is 0. So in fact, 0 is equal to 0. And this first solution checks out just fine. Now, the other thing we want to check is we want to check x is equal to 3 to see if it works. So the way you do that is you plug into the original equation, which is up here, 2 multiplied by 3 squared minus 7 multiplied by 3 plus 3, and we're checking to see if that is equal to 0. If it is equal to 0, then we have a solution. So 3 squared is 9, 2 times 9 is 18, 7 times 3 is 21, so in this case, 18 minus 21 is a -3, and -3 plus 3 is 0. So in this case, indeed, we do get 0, and that one checks out as well. So we do have the solutions to the equations, which are x equals 1/2 and x equals 3 are the two values that solve this particular quadratic equation.